I just want to welcome you and hope that you have a good time today. This is not a workshop like the October workshop will be. It's called a pre-workshop because it's an introduction or reintroduction to the Sea Ranch. We want all of you to um, be refreshed in your knowledge of this place or learn some new things. The important thing is that you enjoy the day and that you walk away with some information, knowledge, observance, whatever that you didn't have before. So we want you to keep your ears and eyes open and have fun. So I have two amazing people who will start the morning. We have Donlyn Lyndon and we have Kevin Keim, and that's all I'm going to say. And
Good morning. Can you hear me? Is that loud enough? All right.
How about me?
Yes.
That's possible too. Think of
Yeah.
that.
Since this is the pre-workshop workshop, I can't decide if I should be here preempting or thinking of myself as the opening act for Taylor Swift. So what we're going to do today is, well, first, actually, before I say anything, I'd like to say thank you to Lou Lyndon for organizing this. And Brooke Lane and Evans Hankey are here too, as are they? Yes, for organizing and extending wonderful hospitality to me and the Vision Committee as well. And I think there are several members here of that. Oh, I'm sorry, the Archives Committee, yeah. So we're here, of course, to talk about the founding ideas and ideals of Sea Ranch. And as much as you would probably benefit from an outsider like me coming to lecture you, what we decided instead is to make this as much a conversation as we're able between me and Donlyn Lyndon here. So Donlyn is simply going to start with reading a preface that he wrote. And then as I continue in, Donlyn will be here to raise points and open up the discussion a little bit more.
So part of our charge was to give a little bit of an account of the development of the Sea Ranch idea and the founding principles and how they came about. And since we are at an introductory point, I'm not going to go into great depth about that, but I have put together a little note about how what it was that started the Sea Ranch. And so I will I'll go ahead and read that. And it begins with a man named Al Boki, many of you undoubtedly have heard about. Al Boki was on assignment from Castle and Cook of Hawaii, the company he worked for, had come here to find a place in the Bay Area for a new town. He learned of a large area of property for sale and was at first skeptical about even thinking about it because that wasn't a place you could have a new town. But then he finally did come up. And though skeptical about to be a place for the new town they were considering. Having seen the property, however, and its situation along the coast, he contacted the owner. He returned to convince his board that it was a good prospect for a second home community. I think Al was actually the one who created that notion of a second home community, although it may be something they were otherwise thinking about doing. Boki then assembled a team of relevant consultants to consider all aspects of the development. He had worked with Larry Halprin on an earlier project in Hawaii and commissioned his firm for planning and landscape development. Together, they assembled related consultants. Halprin identified the architects he thought would be good for the project. Joseph Esherick, and MLTW, which I was part. There were also civil engineering, legal, real estate, publicity, and graphics consultants. He covered all the bases. I probably forgot something. Esherick was an obvious choice as an architect. He was already recognized as an important designer, innovative designer, a leading figure in the emerging group of Bay Area architects working in modern architecture. You have to realize that modern architecture was still controversial in the 50s. MLTW, on the other hand, was newly formed. Halpern said he suggested MLTW, that's Moore, Lyndon, Turnbull, Whitaker. On the other hand, because he suggested MLTW, because he'd seen a cabin in Santa Cruz credited to us while judging a design awards program, and had recommended, over some objection, that it be given a merit award. What he liked about that project was, he said later, was that the primary photograph of the project showed a towering redwood or two and a very small cabin. And he said he thought any architect who would present his project that way was someone he'd want to work with. This large team of development of consultants then assembled in Halpern's office and began, you might say, taking part, making their views known and debated. I did not attend those first meetings as I was teaching at Berkeley. I imagine, though, that Larry Halpern was at the head of the table with Al Boke looking over his shoulder. Charles Moore and Bill Turnbull did attend and eventually wrote, with another attendee, lawyer Reverdy Johnson, the original design guidelines. The concept of the Sea Ranch and the initial principles emerged from the discussion around that table. And those discussions were beautifully captured in the diagrams that Larry Halpern drew, and which we still use to this day to guide what the founding principles of the Sea Ranch are. Most simply put, the principles were intended to guide a development and design process alongside Route 1 that would be uniquely suited to this place and conserve and build upon the character of its coastal landscape, with its open meadows running from the high forested hills to the coastal bluffs, divided by cypress hedgerows planted by farmers earlier in the century, delineating segments of their land and giving some protection from the frequently vigorous winds sweeping down along the north coast from the northwest along the coast. Clustering of buildings and vegetation grouping were an essential aspect of the proposal. Grouping structures together would allow them to become a part of a landscape. Building elements that, together with rows and clumps of tended vegetation, would provide distinct locations and identity, and some weather modification, as with farm buildings throughout the region. Design Committee's guidance over the decades has helped to make this happen. They are a very great resource, as of course are the many people like you who have come to be part of this place and share in its stewardship. Kevin will now talk about some of those things that came out of those meetings and what they imply beyond what I've said.
I've been reading a lot of John Dominic Crossan and Elaine Pedros recently, and Crossan, whenever he writes, always starts with his idea of what history really is or how it plays out. In this quote, there is an interactive loop between the past and the present, in which the past is changing the present and the present is changing the past. And he often said that that was his way of saying that he's trying to bridge the gulf between being a positivist and a narcissist. And it reminds me that that actually has basis in physical reality, because Niels Bohr and Denmark said the act of observation influences that which is being observed. And it's really true that, as he was talking about quantum mechanics, of course, but as you look at a particle, the photons change it. And it's not disputed. And I said to Donlyn yesterday that while that seems to happen in the realm of the very small, people often point out that it happens also when we go to Chevron and try to measure our tire pressure, where the act of measuring affects the tire pressure. And then I was going through all of the many zillions of images we have back in Austin, and I found this great view of the condo blurry in the background, but a horseshoe in front. And then I remembered all of a sudden the anecdote when a visitor to Niels Bohr's country cottage saw a horseshoe hanging on the wall. He asked him about the ancient superstition. Can it be true that you, of all people, believe it will bring you luck? Of course not, but I understand it brings you luck whether you believe it or not. And then there's Laurie Anderson in one of the lyrics to her songs, "Is history is an angel being blown backwards into the future." And I don't quite know what that means, but I've always felt there's some sort of truth lurking between the words somewhere. I haven't found them yet, though. Another point of indemnification is that to do a talk like this within an hour of what is really a very complex and layered history is practically impossible. And I complained about that to Lou bitterly, but she said, you don't want to be here for 8 hours listening to me. And inevitably, when you do this, you're going to leave people out and that shouldn't be left out. And that's just really the circumstance that I'm in. Charles Moore was always the first to point out that buildings benefit, that making places benefit when many are involved, either as actual designers at the table or in the idea of taking part, of whole communities coming together and participating as much as they'd like to, which then was practiced in the sessions that you're going to renew this fall. And the Sea Ranch, while it had the set of people who were intimately involved in the beginning, that wasn't it, of course, that there was a legion of people involved at all layers and through all of the decades since, who've elaborated it and who've added to it to make it the place it is today. These next set of ideas are all 4 ways to say the same thing, but all coming back to the general and the specific. I've asked Lou to distribute to you all an early essay that Charles Moore, Donlyn Lyndon, Sim Vanderen, and Patrick Quinn together wrote. And it was published in J.B. Jackson's Landscape Journal in 1962. And the parts that Charles and Donlyn wrote, I've always felt were really the first time that many of the ideas were brought into focus and set down in just a very concise statement. So if you haven't read that before coming today, I'd urge you to go and download it wherever the link is and enjoy that. But one of the key point about in that essay is the general and the specific, and how for a whole generation, really, architects were led to believe that you begin with the general, that you develop a kind of set of formulas and generalized responses that then can be applied willy-nilly to any place, wherever the client brings you in. When MLTW started work here, and really with buildings that they had already done, they realized that the opposite approach was better, to start with the specific and carefully study what the specific responses need to be, and then apply it to the more general conditions. The idea of genus and species is really the same thing, and one that also has a great presence here at Sea Ranch, as anywhere on the planet. And genus as a concept was first pioneered by Tourneforth. And one example that I always think of here is the Monterey cypress. And the idea of genus is that a group of plants or life forms can appear anywhere on the planet, despite the separation by oceans or landforms. But it's the species, it's the act of adaptation and evolution and selection that makes that life form specific to the conditions of the place. And the Monterey cypress is fascinating because it was barely hanging on when it was first discovered, probably in maybe the late 17th century or 18th century, on just two little isolated pockets in the Monterey area. And when it was discovered, it was then propagated in many places, even Kew Gardens in England. And now here at Sea Ranch, of course, where they've become such an important part of the landscape. When Charles and Donlyn and Bill Turnbull were at Princeton, there was a professor of Chinese art, George Rowley, that was important for them. And he spoke about the whole arc of Chinese art being about ideograms and wrinkles, which again is saying the same thing, where you have the large idea of the drawing and the large form of the landscape, but then the wrinkles that really begin to make that world of almost fractal wonder within.
That was really very important to us, that concept that we needed to think both ends of the process, the initial general idea, and then what was specific that you were making in that place.
That's right. And here, this is not a Chinese drawing, but this is Charles Moore's version of a Chinese drawing, where you start with almost just a kind of a random brush of the watercolor brush to create the large landscape order. And then with the fine tip pen, you go in and create those unlikely worlds within those canyons. And then Charles Moore's choreography of the familiar and the surprising. He said he got to a point where he felt that that many architects were trying to just create too much surprise, in a sense, and ending up with places that were alien to people. They couldn't relate and understand how to inhabit them through the patterns that people naturally have for inhabiting. So he said that he felt that places should have a lot of the familiar to ground people, to make something that is coherent and tangible and filled with things of a common language. And then surprise has to be carefully added, even if it's in defiance of the building inspector, which this staircase, which was originally at the very top of condo 1 was, and you practically had to have a choreography to climb it. I think that the anxiety of influences is important too. Later at Yale, Harold Bloom was there and wrote, of course, mostly about Shakespeare, but wrote a book about the anxiety of influence. And Charles really identified with that because he he felt that, again, at a time you weren't supposed to be influenced. You were supposed to practically ignore what had come before, and instead focus on creating the world from scratch. And so he felt that being vulnerable and being willing to look at things, to absorb things, so that they inform your work and open up possibility was an important ethic to have. Here's just a quick set of images of all kinds of things that may have informed things here at CRAN. So starting with the Gregory homestead by William Worcester, who yesterday you were saying.
That when I was a teenager, first interested in architecture. I mean, my father was an architect, so I was born to do that. But one of the images in a book from the Museum of Modern Art about modern architecture was an image, not quite that one, of the Gregory farmhouse. And that stayed with me front and center as an important reference, an important idea, the surrounding courtyard and the tower that at the beginning. And there's a little of that buried in the condominium.
Lou Kahn, and this in particular, the Trenton Bathhouse of 1955, I'll talk a little bit more about later. There's always John Soane, Sir John Soane of London, who I think Charles either felt he was a reincarnation of, or was just about the most worthy architect who had ever lived.
Which made him an incarnation of it.
This is a graphic here that first appeared in the journal Spirale that was published in Switzerland. It was by Marcel Wyss of 1955. I think important too was Edward Larrabee Barnes's wonderful architect, Haystack complex off the coast of, on a bits of island off the coast of Maine.
Yes, yeah. Which was very much published just about the time we were starting the condominium, and was very much one of the things we had really truly admired.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Barnes also did, there's a very exclusive island, both geographic and socially, off the coast of Connecticut, Fisher Island. And Barnes did exquisite houses there that were really just ultra simplifications of shingle style houses. In fact, he did one for Jim Ryder's parents.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yes, Jim Ryder is a marvelous architect in Boston who was a student of Charles Moore's at
The
Yale.
specific reference right there, I'll jump in, is I remember vividly when Al Boki came to our office, which was in a little sort of tiny railroad station because it was the lookout for a freight line. And he came, and we had this one room. We all had desks in, and we talked to him. We showed him all our work, and talked about it, and talked about some of the other things that we admired, and so on. And he was interested and interesting. And then, as he was going out the door, I remember him standing at the door and turning around and saying, "Well, it's Barnes enough for me." And I'm sure he meant barn like this, and he meant barn like the Edward Larrabee Barnes. Yes, right. I'm positive. I never asked him if that's what he meant, but I'm certain it is.
And I love this image too. This is when Charles knew that he was likely to be drafted for service in Korea, so he enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers and was indeed sent to Seoul for 2 years. And I love this because this is a sign that he designed in '53, pointing the way to whatever it was he was trying to construct in, the Wobegon mud flat. out there. That's not Charles Moore standing there. It's one of his colleagues. And I should add too that that actually was a very important time that has to do with what we're talking about today, because on leave, like most of the men, he would go to Japan. And it was his first time to look at Japanese gardens and houses. And it was an absolutely important revelation to see. He often wrote how they were putting together pieces of timber with such sensitivity and with such cleverness, really, of art. And then how you deal with objects and buildings and spaces in the landscape, and the whole tradition of layering to both emphasize space, but create all of those zones moving from inside to outside and from outside to inside. Toward Making Places, Charles wrote, the creation of place amounts at first to taking possession of a portion of the earth's surface. Then architecture being an act, that process of taking possession is abstracted as life is abstracted by the playwright. This is an image of the building site at Orindo, the first house that Charles designed for himself. And that site is quite literally a stage, because it had been bulldozed into a kind of little flat area within a much broader valley hillside. And the first step in making this house, in fact, I've been writing a book about this house. And the first act of doing this house was to just simply inscribe a square 24 feet on each side that became the perimeter of the place. And so this morning, I thought that this really can be understood, our presentation, as an act, a play in 5 acts. The idea, the landscape, condominium 1, hedgerow houses, and Moonraker.
The 24 feet, I'd forgotten that was the dimension of that house. It's the dimension of a unit of the condominium, which was not coincident.
So Act 1, the Sea Ranch would not have become a reality without Al Boke's vision. As a young architect, Boke grew interested in an era of building known as the New Town movement. This movement arose when Europeans began building entire new towns and even small cities in the aftermath of the Continental Wars. Scandinavians built the most distinguished examples. In their minds, they sought to perfect the very idea of town by unifying architecture, engineering, planning, landscape, and even public art into one coordinated effort. All of the elements of the traditional town, houses, schools, churches, markets, parks, were considered small parts of the whole. And the towns would materialize rapidly, virtually all at once. This was a radical departure from the ways towns traditionally evolved in Europe, gradually in fits and starts, with layers accruing over centuries. New towns would cast away the cramped inefficiencies of the medieval village, along with its implicit social inequities. The New Town movement also arose in the United States, but with more suburban results, not as cohesive, less dedicated to the public realm. Boke turned his attention to Northern California. His search soon led him to a seat aboard a small aircraft. The pilot flew him over the Olson Ranch, whose owners had listed its availability just the day before. As he surveyed the site from above, tracing up the coast, circling back over the Wallowa River, and then up again, he marveled at the landscape. Dramatic bluffs rose from the Pacific, sweeping inland as relatively flat terraces, meadows upon which thousands of sheep graze. Along the entire length of this great geological shelf, 27 hedgerows divided the land into discrete parcels. The land then rose up into a forested ridge, and it was a landscape organized on a heroic scale, so evident from the aircraft, but later explorations on foot revealed a world of finer scale detail. and Boki knew this was the place. As Donlyn mentioned, this really began in Hawaii because Al was working with Castle and Cook, and they felt that costly real estate, which could no longer simply be supporting pineapple cultivation, could instead be used for real estate development. And so the first one they did is called Mililani, and Larry Helplin was in fact involved in that. And after making a success of that, Boki persuaded Castle and Cook, that would become Oceanic Properties, to let him try something on the main one. And he was on the verge of purchasing property near San Diego. And it was only because somebody said, hang on, I've just heard about a property that could become available up in Sonoma. And we both think that Boki even resisted going up to see it because he didn't feel that that would be an appropriate place. The fellow insisted and said, look, get in the plane, you pay for the gas, we're going up. When he saw it, he knew. And an important part of taking this back to Hawaii was saying that I understand that this place is not as ideal as we would anticipate, but if we think more about this place as a second home community, that is the way to go, really. And as we all know, a part of the wonder of Sea Ranch is the act of getting here, which I've always felt has been the kind of really what has saved Sea Ranch, that it's just too far so that it hasn't been completely overtaken and made into something that doesn't have this feeling of great isolation and freedom and independence, really, within the landscape. Central to the vision was an ethic, an ideal that they would respect the land. Knowing that such a compelling place could be swiftly and irrevocably damaged by haphazard development, they wanted instead to shape a community that would preserve the landscape's feeling of openness and freedom. There would not be a barricade of houses a la Malibu lined up along the coast, nor would this be a destination resort. While there would be the pleasures of swimming and tennis and golf, the experience of nature would be the principal asset. The Sea Ranch would be a place in favor of meditative inhabitation rather than exploitation. Boki also knew quality architecture was essential. Buildings should provide people simple but dignified dwellings. The architecture, like the agricultural buildings here, would negotiate the relationship people can form with nature. Planning and design guidelines would provide the framework for a sense of cohesion and integrity, both aesthetically and programmatically. To build this place on such a vast scale, in a remote location and from scratch, involved layers and layers of important consideration, from fresh water to road building and from utilities to Sonoma County regulations. Boki had to act as nothing less than a master choreographer. He had to orchestrate the efforts of architects, civil engineers, structural engineers, landscape architects, foresters, graphic designers, attorneys, county officials, bankers, builders, marketers, and corporate colleagues, a legion of professionals, each with their own subset of complexities. If one of the elements were to falter, then all of the others would be thrown off kilter, imperiling the entire effort, especially since time itself is a critical factor in this realm of endeavor. One story I love is that Al said that one of the specialists they hired was a hydrologist because they had first to figure out where the water would come from. And this man spent weeks divining, really, along the meadows, poking it and prodding and drilling, whatever he did, and came back and said, no problem, plenty of water, nothing to worry about. Later, both Al and Larry realized that they had purchased this large tract of land, but the one thing it didn't have yet was a little part where people could get to the river. And they felt that was important to get. Oceanic didn't think so because they didn't want to write any more checks for more land. And they said, forget about it. But they insisted. They said, look, this is just a small parcel. Let's get it. Give everybody the opportunity for canoeing and fishing and being down there. And they said, okay, just buy it. Al said, had we not done that, we would have been in deep trouble because the hydrologists were completely wrong. There is not groundwater up on those shelves that is either present or easily gotten to. And he said that the water came ultimately from a river flowing under the Walala River. And I love that because, again, this is when you embark on projects like this, no matter what scale, you always encounter, as I'm sure you all know if you've ever been clients, problems and challenges and unanticipated realities, sometimes which serendipity comes to save the day.
And may I interject one little story? They was having lunch one day with someone who turned out to be one of the surveyors who was involved in laying things out in the first place. He said, well, you know, it was really very difficult because my particular job with that surveying team was to go out and make sure there were ways that the lines of the property could be put out through the landscape without destroying the foliage. And without destroying foliage, marking, going around and marking and having to go through that. And that was such a fine example of the scope of thinking about how to make this place in a way that honored its landscape. I've always loved that story.
Act 2, the landscape. Again, going back to Toward Making Places, they included this quote: "The richly varied places of the natural world are structured in an ordered relationship that is yet full for people of drama and surprise." Paul Shepard wrote that. And only recently did I realize, of course, that very early on, just after we got the foundation going in Austin, we did a field trip here. And that it was literally a field trip, like I guess we would call it a meadow trip, where it was a walking tour of the ski ranch. And that is Larry in the suspenders right there. Amazingly, that's Paul Shepard, the son of Paul Shepard, who back in 1953, they selected this quote. Paul himself is a writer of landscape and was the very first resident at the Charles Moore Foundation when we got started in Austin. I love the idea of these trajectories and the kind of nettlesome connections that make life worth living. I've often tried to imagine what it was like for Larry to suddenly get this project that he had been working on a lot of gardens and small parks, and to suddenly have this daunting prospect of dealing with just an immense piece of land. How do you even get your arms around that? How do you come and make an impact that is both proper and meaningful and legible? It was an awesome prospect. And he began literally by immersing himself in the place, coming here, living here, camping, and getting into it, into the thicket, as it were, to come to a fundamental understanding of this piece of land. And he drew and he drew and he drew and he drew and he watercolored and drew and watercolored more. And you can't go to architecture or design schools anymore and have a lot of people like us lament about how nobody draws anymore. Drawing, there's something so neurologically important about drawing, about using it as a way to understand something, to notice things that you can't notice in front of a computer screen. These drawings shared a single theme, that nature and landscape are shaped by force and energy and growth, action and reaction, change and adaptation. Halperin began his work at the ski ranch with a systematic study of every aspect of the landscape, a thorough environmental and cultural assessment. He hiked and camped on the beach, on the ranch, to better understand its wildlife, vegetation, geology, and oceanography, and how they were all influenced by wind, sun, and water. Dick Reynolds, a geographer on his staff, compiled detailed observations and inventories of the site's natural resources. Halperin devised richly annotated drawings. Some spiraled out like a conch, unraveling chronologically and illustrating geological strata and later cultural overlays left there by natives, settlers, farmers, loggers, and ranchers.
This is one of the diagrams I was talking about that becomes so fundamental. But one of the things I always like to point out about this diagram is that where we are on the time scale, it's a little tiny bit down there. And that was actually a very important insight, that we were coming into something which had been formed by enormous range of things over a long period of time. That's always held, I think, in this diagram incorporates that beautifully.
Together with his wife, Anna Halperin, a dancer and choreographer, Larry invented methods of design and documentation they called scoring, arising both from ideas in the dance studio as well as the landscape office. Just as a traditional score would outline a work orchestrally or choreographically, Halperin's scores unfurled a set of investigations and actions leading to the creation of a place. The scores emphasized that places were made as much of materials as they were of human action and time. And here is Larry and Anna and Charles Moore on the beach. And this really doesn't show, it's the only image I could find up here, but this doesn't show what the exercises really were. They were exercises where Larry, as a leader, would gather together those who were participating, often students too, who were brought up from Berkeley or UCLA later on. And they were set up as well plays, not theater, but interactive, abstracted play with the landscape. So again, it could lead into observations and nuanced understanding of what they were dealing with here. Halperin read the landscape as a place of compelling juxtapositions of scale, sublime grandiosity down to intricate delicacy. There is the larger order, the coves, rocks, bluffs, meadows, Highway 1, the upper slopes forest, and the Walala River. But then there is within the smaller order, riparian passages, trails, roads, folds, ravines, hedgerows, thickets, all places that could localize people within the landscape. The challenge was how to preserve the feeling of wide openness. Clustering became a dominant theme, with many implications and advantages. Clustering would concentrate dwellings, localizing groupings in a place and resisting suburban entropy. Clustering would encourage social connection. Clustering, particularly along hedgerows, would allow meadows to remain open. Clustering would maximize view corridors. Clustering would be economical, diminishing the numbers and lengths of roads and utility easements. Clustering, particularly along hedgerows, would better tame the wind. And clustering would metaphorically relate to all kinds of clustering favored by nature: forest grouping, flocks of birds, accumulations of rocks, communities of grasses and wildflowers. And then last, this photo I love because it is almost a kind of latter-day realization of how Larry often drew and watercolored. And it was always about these layers, where again, you have something in the foreground setting off the scale. And going back to Japan, that idea of the spatial compression within the landscape that creates rooms and spaces as you're moving from light to dark and dark to light through this landscape. So Act 3, Condominium 1. Donlyn wrote in Toward Making Places, whereas most decisions concerning the general nature of the design were the outgrowth of informal discussions among the partners, and that's Charles Moore, Donlyn Lyndon, Bill Turnbull, and Dick Whitaker. They were, whenever possible, formulated in such a way that specific design decisions could be taken separately by various partners without dismembering a sense of a coherent place. At some stages of the design, this worked particularly well. Much of the sought-after variety in unit arrangement results from partners separately manipulating the internal components. At other times, the work has proceeded best from working over each other's drawings, or pooling our efforts in swirling conferences that mix serious images with follies, puns, and barbed criticism.
Yes, there was plenty of the barbed criticism. But also, just parenthetically, doesn't come from those sessions, but one thing that always actually showed me aspects of Charles I hadn't quite understood. I was one time running a conference where I had the major speakers, then working with other teachers who were at the session and doing little workshops. And then I went around and saw what they were each doing. And I came to Charles's table and I stood and watched for a while. There were 5 or 6 other teachers of architecture, as it were students. And they had this big table and this big map out there, and there was a little library they were working on. And it was all very interesting, and they were all sitting around. And then Charles was sitting there with the pencil in his hand. One of the students said, "Oh, you know, Charles, I think that corner over there on the left, it really just doesn't work. You know, it really isn't up to what this needs to be." And Charles took an eraser and erased it. And then said about drawing something in relation to what the guy was saying. But that was such an act of confidence that one of the secrets of Charles Moore's success is how self-confident he was, that he would be open to and absorb things from everybody else and then merge them into what he was thinking. That was a great part of the whole dynamic of MLTW and of our relationship to the place.
And I think it's important to say again how this kind of interaction within an architecture practice was really the antithesis of how they operated at the time, which is to say other practices. They were not organized like this. And I've often said MLTW was more like a band, and that you had the guy in the office, the glass office, smoking a cigar, ruling over the roost. and then teams of draftsmen at tables in grids with long white sleeved shirts and black neckties, tightly tied. And another thing I want to point out about that quote is that it's not from Toward Making Places. It's from a publication that came a little bit later called World Architecture. And right from the start, the world took notice of what was going on here. And that's important to understand the impact that it had, because it was a set of ideas that, again, was so contrary to how things were supposed to happen. And it did turn a whole generation or more in a new direction. Donlyn brought up earlier the Sunset Magazine competition. And Larry said, yes, well, you know, I chose MLTW because I arrived late. I was a juror at Sunset Magazine, and my fellow jurors had already rejected a bunch of entries. And so he was flipping through the poster board and pulled this out, and he said, why is this rejected? And they said, that's not architecture. I mean, look at it. And Larry said, well, I think it is. And I think that we need to reconsider it. And he said, if you don't, we should at least give the Redwoods Awards. But he remembered this. And it's called the Bonham Cabin. And it was just a tiny, tiny little thing that was built in the Santa Cruz Mountains. No longer extent changed beyond recognition. But it's such a wonderful play of scale that you see the front door down below, right? That's the height of the door. You see, right? And your initial impression is that, no, this is a human being would be, you know, up there, but it's not. And the wonderful inversion that they decided upon, where you're not supposed to be impressed from the street by the scale of things. But then instead, when you pass through the threshold, you're drawn into a world that you don't expect. And it's the basis of every fairy tale, really, of finding worlds that somehow exist within worlds that can't or shouldn't accommodate them, whether a wardrobe or a rabbit hole.
It's important to understand that the other side of this house that you're not seeing in this photograph is one huge window.
I have this urge to recreate this building back in Austin on a little
I
discrete.
don't think it belongs in Austin.
Well, if we get our plutonium reactor online to cool it, then it'll work. These early models are terrific because they explain, going back to the 24-foot module, that they realized on the table in the office was a dish of sugar cubes. And putting the scale up against them, they realized that, wait, those are actually the scale, we could use them. And the idea of the condominiums was, how do you create the density of use, but allow the different units to have their views and their connections to the different parts of the landscape, to cluster them together to form a village, and to create a sense of something inhabiting the landscape. And so the studies had to do with constantly shifting these around and playing with them. Not to
Photograph doesn't show very well. The white is really the sugar cube.
Yes.
Only sort of a void here.
And some tacks are trees.
Yeah, right. 3 rows. Thank you very much.
It's important to understand too that the initial idea is that there would be several condominiums.
Yeah.
Right.
That went on down the coast.
Mm-hmm. Each of the 10 units is completely different, without a single interior elevation repeated. For developers of apartments and condominiums, this itself is a radical departure, as aligning or stacking identical units saves time, money, and intellectual effort. For MLTW, however, the architecture of mechanical replication and unyielding grids had run its course. With so many inhabitants, so many views to be framed, so many basic human needs requiring accommodation, this structure could easily have and swiftly spiraled out of visual control had it not been for the architect's discipline, who insisted that every move, every gesture, every urge had to have a compelling reason. It is a finely refereed contest of order and disorder, intention and serendipity, general form and detail, expression and economy. Elevations were not so much composed out of dogmatic allegiance to formalism or symmetry, but rather resulted from realities emanating from each unit. Projections extend from the core because they provide people a useful space or compelling view or both. And notice how the multitude of skylights are not arranged with any rigid geometric order, but instead appear simply where they need to be, confirming perhaps the old adage that there are no attractive arrangements of sheep on an English hillside. And I'm just going to say very swiftly that much of this grew out of back to Orinda House over the hill from Berkeley. This was the house that Charles designed that was this discrete shell, simple as a child's drawing, but then within a realm of layers and not one edicula, but two ediculas. So you have this richness. And you see in plan here the 4 sets of ediculas and how they create practically a sense of monumentality within this tiny little house. And then you move into condo 9, where you have the sense of all of this toolkit of parts of the ediculas, of the cabinet that act as large-scale pieces of furniture, of towers that become bookshelves, all being arranged differently in each unit to create a kind of interior village that you climb through and explore. And always thinking about the distinctions between inside and outside, and those layers of planes and openings, of solidity, of transparency that make you sense that you are a part of the landscape outside. Hedgerow houses. This is an early photograph of Joe Esherick with his uncle Wharton Esherick back in Pennsylvania, and a photograph of Joe's sister's Margaret Esherick's house that Lou Kahn designed. And the point of these images is to say that much of what Joe brought here grew out of work that he did in Pennsylvania and in school in Pennsylvania, and the mentorship of his uncle, who was a fine craftsman. And then also, similarly to MLTW, a great and enduring influence from Lou Kahn. Wharton, in fact, made the cabinetry and the parts for the house. Esherick clustered the homes closely, sometimes linking them with fences and low walls, suggesting a community of dwelling. But he also carefully staggered the houses to avoid an unnatural imposition of an unyielding order on the landscape. The offsets guarantee views for each house, all while protecting the privacy of the living and sleeping spaces within. Variations in the volumes are made by indentations or small projections, each responding to particular folds and ripples on the site. Decades after their construction, the hedgerow houses have the feeling of wise farm cottages that have, over generations, nestled into their landscape as the fields around them inched higher and higher as farmers added compost. Here, the houses of nests settled into the landscape and even more as the meadow ecology has naturalized and as the vigorously growing Monterey cypress trees have filled in and even engulfed some of the houses in tangles of limbs, such as this magnificent image and idea. Esherick chose hand-split shakes for the exterior walls, which weather beautifully, not unlike the mottled bark of pine trees. Notice how dimensions are never too narrow so that shakes need to be chopped into awkward pieces. The builders and carpenters always laid down the shakes so that there is both an organic feeling and a crisp modern aesthetic. Each elevation is carefully composed of simply divided windows, which can slide open for air, as well as tall, skinny ones that mimic brick chimneys' vertical jabs. Windows, smooth, glassy panes contrast the wall's chipped texture. The paucity of trim or unnecessary ornament reinforce that these houses find poetry even with the slimmest vocabulary of material. We point out always, we were talking yesterday about how the form of the buildings had to respond to the realities of the condition. And here we see how shingles, while they work on deeper pitched roofs, don't work on shallower ones. So the obvious or the wise move was to move the sod off of those, which then adds to the sense of them becoming a part of the landscape. Unlike condominiums, one's intentional rusticity, the timbers in these houses are somewhat more refined, planed, and sanded, but never so rarefied that we feel too guarded, as these are places of retreat and casual comfort. Columns and beams are exposed, so we have a sense of the internal structure of the skeleton, but do not stand freely in the space, indented instead into the walls and ceilings. These are compact houses, rigorously and efficiently planned. The architect eliminated most corridors so spaces overlap and merge with one another. Living spaces rise as the shed roof ascend, while bedrooms tuck in under the ridge beams. Since interior living spaces are sometimes excavated, windows sit just above grade, so that dining table surfaces share the same plane as the meadow grasses outside. We are not perched above the landscape, looking down on it patronizingly, but are nestled in it, made to feel a part of the place. And I should add too that, of course, we forget that the lodge was built simultaneously with both the condo and the hedgerow houses, and was important for the organization of the whole place, but also the kind of public identity of it as literally the beacon. And here I'll introduce too, of course, Bobby Stoffaker-Solomon, whose involvement was absolutely fundamental, because she, of course, evolved the graphic language of Sea Ranch, starting with the famous ram's horns, the use of Helvetica, naturally, as she was coming from her education in Switzerland, and this wonderful contrast of the crisp, dead flat plane of graphics set against these volumes and the rough, rustic texture of the building, but then also the fine, detailed presence of nature, the grasses, petals, all of this, this wonderful, not collision, but contrast makes it such a, it just makes it a powerful graphic presence. And then finally, oh, and here is somebody in their VW zooming up late for a meeting. And finally, Moonraker, which I'll swim through. This again, I go back to the importance of Trenton Bath House, not because the form really has anything to do with it, but rather the idea that a simple building for simple purposes, changing a wet swimming suit, doesn't have to be ordinary. It can be made into something. And I think a part of what made all of this work so compelling was that it wasn't about an expression of costly, exclusive materials or, well, budgets that we all know are minuscule compared to what people have for houses today. But it was the set of ideas that made the building. It was the effort that was put into making a building that solved problems in ways that weren't quite intuitive. That's what made these buildings great. So that the problem, the charge with the pool or the swim club was simple, that wet bodies, tennis balls don't like wind. And how do you deal with that? And this being the first swim club was meant to be very small, modest, small pool, one tennis court. And it became this fundamental collaboration between landscape and architecture that solved these ideas by Larry impressing the two needs, the pool and the tennis court, into the earth and surrounding them with berms. And then where one berm is left out, that becomes this single wall that is the gesture that becomes the windbreak and the way to organize the spaces for the men's and women's sections. I think you once said that it was a diagram made manifest.
Yeah.
Here you see this single wall just sailing out perpendicular to the horizon. And then all of the spaces are made as saddlebags that you can't quite explain if the wall is holding up the saddlebags or if the saddlebags are holding up the wall. And then it's this tongue-in-cheek reference to the Gothic flying buttress. I often think as though the Abbot of Chartres had been hired to do a stage set for a spaghetti Western in Durango. Right? And you then are presented with not now a narrow, skinny wall with just a cap on the top, a line, but now a full-fledged elevation, nearly Palladian in quality, where all of the individual elements are just there because that's where they need to be to achieve their purpose. And it creates this elevation that makes this into both a stage set, going back to the act of taking possession of this, and the kind of Western false front, going back to the movies, where the drama of life is acted out. Alboki evidently felt the interiors were too austere, too white, too boring. And so he asked Bobby to do something about that. And this became the great, Capo Lavoro, the masterpiece, where all of a sudden, and again, going back to the idea of the geode, of thwarting your expectations about scale and about contrast, you come into this, you pass into this little board building made of a single material, and you're thrust into this world that you don't expect. And let me just read it. I say what I want to say. With only cans of paint, rules, and masking tape, Bobby Stoffaker Solomon and a team of sign painters transformed the Moonraker interiors. They covered the walls corner to corner, floor to ceiling, full bleed, with radically scaled up graphics. Charles more often described the buildings as geodes, structures of rough simplicity on the outside that once cracked open, people could discover complex crystalline worlds within. Stoffaker Solomon's work of art, Moonraker, became such a geode, a redwood shell, wooden and allowed to naturally weather on the outside. But then a simple step across the threshold carried you into a wholly unanticipated realm of stripes, dots, chevrons, arrows, and giant Helvetica letters such as S for sauna. He only used vivid solid colors, red, orange, purple, blue, green, yellow, set against planes of white and the occasional dash of black, all registered directly against each other without any blending or shading. It was all purposeful play with the very idea of scale. Circles whose diameter matches the height of a door makes us aware of our own relationship to the architecture, mindful of Leonardo's famous analysis of human form. The Paul Bunyan supergraphics are of such unexpected scale, they managed to deflect people's attention from noticing just how Lilliputian the spaces are. Colors of different value play with our perception of spatial depth and perspective, while some shapes are geometrically ambiguous, drawn from psychologists' graphic tests of how minds can be tricked into perceiving volume where none exist in flat planes. And then finally, I want to go back to this image with just a small personal anecdote, and then we'll be done. When I began work with Charles, fresh out of college, it was only a week into my job that the secretary handed me a plane ticket and said, "Oh, you'll be going to San Francisco tomorrow to pick up Charles at the airport, and then you're going to go up to the sea ranch." And I hadn't been there. And we drove up, my first time going up Highway 1, in seething rain. And it was pitch black. I mean, just absolutely a kind of monsoon at midnight. And winding up, it was probably better that I didn't see anything. And when we arrived, I had known Sea Ranch only through drawings and images. And when you stepped into that room, that redwood tent, it was such a, I'll never forget it, it was such a feeling of shelter, of arrival, of coming somewhere. And Charles, just in the way we did, would just kind of flip on the light switch because he knew exactly where it was and go through his whole routine. And he went straight up the stairs to bed and he just said, "Oh, sleep on the window seat." I did. And the windows were black. You literally couldn't see anything. And the next morning, I woke up and my eyes just suddenly took in this, I mean, magnificent image of the Pacific just there. And I realized, I said, "Oh, I get it. Now I get it." So it's been wonderful to come back all of these years and learn something with every trip, and to really be a kind of interloper here.
Kevin, I might take the liberty of offering a few words that might guide people with some of the ideas you put forward. Guide people as they go into these workshops, into working with each other over the table and so on. And that is that one is that the buildings become part of the landscape. And that's one of the things that makes really good buildings here work. And that means not just the landscape that's green, but the other buildings that are nearby. And when things relate to each other, they make a larger sense of place than they can by themselves. And then secondly, it's terribly important to have lots of interest and energy inside the spaces that takes advantage of looking out, takes advantage of how light comes in, and that working with sheltering from the wind and bringing light into the place, and then establishing little places that you can have special that are really important to you. And probably you all have all of these in all your houses, but that they are expressed and become features about the house inside and out. That is the way of making places here that really take advantage of here and that become a part of the place and of the landscape that is the place. And so I urge you to be thinking about those sorts of things as you're taking part in the rest of this